Have you ever looked at an old photograph and felt it looking back? Sometimes history hides not in books or monuments, but in the quiet gaze of faces, long gone faces that seem to whisper secrets across the years. In a dusty attic in Salem, Massachusetts, a woman named Sarah Martinez found a forgotten family portrait from 1878, a simple image that should have meant nothing more than memory. But when she looked closer, something in the photograph defied time itself. A child holding a strange leather book, words too clear, too dangerous for their era, and a mystery that would unravel the story of a family who refused to let freedom end when history said it should. Tonight, we follow Sarah's journey through archives, hidden letters, and the echoes of an underground network that refused to die. What she discovered would change not only her family's past, but the story of America's conscience itself. So settle in, dim the lights, and let's return to Salem, where one photograph changed everything. They say every attic holds its own kind of silence. Not the hollow quiet of emptiness, but the kind that hums softly, waiting, as if the past itself is still listening. On a late September afternoon in Salem, Massachusetts, Sarah Martinez found herself beneath slanted beams and layers of dust that shimmered in the fading light. She had come to clean out her grandmother's old house, a place that seemed to breathe with the memory of those who had walked its narrow halls before. Her grandmother, Elela Nena, had passed just 3 months earlier, leaving behind a home filled not with wealth, but with whispers. The air was heavy with the scent of cedar and thyme. Boxes leaned tiredly against the walls, quilts mottled by moths, and stacks of yellowed letters sealed in fading ribbons. Sarah brushed aside the cobwebs, her hands trembling slightly, as she reached beneath a pile of vintage dresses and felt the cool, cracked surface of leather. It was a photo album, thick, weighty, and older than anyone she'd ever known. The brass corners were tarnished green with age. When she opened it, the binding sighed the sound of a century unfolding. The first photograph was a formal portrait, sepia-toned, carefully mounted on brittle backing paper. Beneath it, in faint, careful handwriting, read, "The Morrison family, Salem, Massachusetts, October 1878. 6 faces stared out from the past. The father stern, proud with a beard like carved oak, the mother pale and severe, her hair drawn tightly from her face. 4 children arranged with the rigid order of the era. And yet, something in that stillness unsettled Sarah. It wasn't just the distance of time, there was a wrongness, quiet but undeniable. Her eyes drifted to the youngest girl, perhaps 10 years old, clutching something in her small hands. Something that didn't belong in a portrait, meant to capture family pride. Sarah squinted, then carried the album downstairs to her grandmother's kitchen, where the afternoon light was stronger. She set the photograph gently on the table and used her phone to zoom in. At first, it was just texture, grain shadow, the faint blur of age. But as the image sharpened, Sarah froze. The child's hands were wrapped around a small leather journal, its cover clearly visible even through the haze of time. And there, written across it in deliberate, unmistakable letters, were the words, "Underground Railroad Station Log." Sarah's breath caught. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, looked again. The words didn't fade. They remained there, bold and utterly impossible. Why would a family in 1878, 13 years after slavery was abolished, be photographed holding something so dangerous, so specific? That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The image looped in her mind. By morning, she was at her laptop, fingers trembling, as she typed Morrison family, Salem 1870s into the archives of the Salem Historical Society. Hours passed. Dusty names appeared. Records flickered to life. There they were, Jonathan and Rebecca Morrison and their 4 children, Thomas, Mary Elizabeth, and Catherine the youngest. Jonathan was described as a merchant, a philanthropist, and curiously, a friend to freedom. The next day, Sarah visited Boston University to meet with Dr. Robert Chen, a photography expert who specialized in 19th century photographic techniques. She showed him the image on her screen. He leaned closer, silent for a long while. Then, in a low voice, he said, "This is extraordinary." He adjusted his glasses, studying the fine details. The grain, the clarity, the exposure, all period accurate. And yet, the legibility of that text is nearly impossible for that era. He turned to her. "If this is genuine, Ms. Martinez, you may be looking at a missing link in Underground Railroad history." He agreed to conduct a full forensic analysis on the original print. As Sarah left his office, her thoughts tangled like vines: excitement, disbelief, fear. What had her grandmother been keeping hidden all this time? Her research deepened. The Morrison name surfaced again and again in abolitionist newsletters, in shipping records that avoided southern ports, in financial donations to freedom societies long after the war had ended. And then came the most startling find, a letter from Jonathan Morrison, himself preserved in the archives of the Peabody Essex Museum. With the help of curator Linda Jacobson, Sarah was granted access to the museum's climate-controlled storage. There, in a small wooden box labeled Morrison Estate 1925, she found 3 objects: a bundle of coded letters, a map of Massachusetts marked with faint dots, and impossibly a leather journal identical to the one in the photograph. The handwriting matched the signature in the letter. Inside were dated entries, names, cryptic notations, a continuation of the Underground Railroad long after its supposed end. One entry read, "My dear Henry, the work continues, though its nature has changed. We now aid those bound not by chains but by contracts. The Chinese laborers, the Irish in service, the lost and the forgotten. Freedom must evolve as does bondage." Sarah's fingers trembled as she turned the pages. The Morrison family hadn't simply let the Underground Railroad die with emancipation. They had transformed it from a path of physical escape to one of survival against new kinds of enslavement. One journal entry dated October 15, 1878 made her heart skip a beat. "Today we photographed the family with young Catherine holding the station log. Should anything happen to us, this image will serve as proof, a beacon for those who continue the mission." The portrait had been deliberate, a secret message frozen in silver and light. Why had no one known? Why had history gone silent about them? Dr. Chen's forensic report arrived a week later. The photograph was authentic. Its paper, its chemical composition, all perfectly aligned with the 1870s. No tampering, no anachronism. He looked at Sarah with something close to reverence. "You've found proof that the Underground Railroad didn't end. It adapted. Sarah's investigation drew the attention of Dr. Margaret Foster at the Smithsonian, a scholar who'd spent her life studying abolitionist networks. Through countless late-night calls, Dr. Foster helped Sarah trace the Morrison connections, from Salem to Philadelphia, from coded letters to safe houses repurposed for immigrant workers. What emerged was a ghost map of compassion invisible to textbooks but alive in secret deeds. The Morrisons had quietly sheltered Chinese railroad workers fleeing debt bondage, Irish maids trapped in domestic servitude, Italian stonemasons promised wages that never came. Jonathan Morrison had seen that the chains had only changed shape, and still he fought. Weeks later, Sarah drove to Concord, Massachusetts, where she met Ruth Morrison Parker, Jonathan's 89-year-old great-granddaughter. Ruth's apartment smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Her eyes gleamed when Sarah mentioned the photograph. "Grandfather Jonathan was the family's conscience," she said softly. "He never stopped helping people, even when it wasn't safe." From a closet, Ruth pulled out boxes wrapped in yellow ribbon. Inside were letters, maps, and fragile receipts, proof of donation lists of names and testimonies written in broken English. One from a Chinese worker read, "They gave me a new name, a safe house, a second life." Another from an Irish servant girl. "They said freedom had ended, but Mr. Morrison told me, freedom never ends, it just hides until someone calls it back." Ruth smiled faintly. "He told my father these papers would matter one day. I suppose he was right." Sarah realized then that she wasn't just uncovering history, she was continuing it. The attic. The photograph, her grandmother's silence. It had all been part of something much larger, something waiting for her to find it. With Dr. Foster's help, Sarah compiled a report that would change the way historians viewed the years after the Civil War. Their findings revealed a network of quiet heroism families like the Morrisons, who believed that freedom wasn't a moment in history, but a duty carried forward in secret. Months later, the Smithsonian unveiled a new exhibition titled Beyond Abolition, the continuing fight for human dignity. At its heart, under dim light and silent glass, stood the Morrison family photograph, 6 solemn faces frozen in time. The smallest child still clutching the journal that refused to disappear. Visitors said they could feel something in the air, a kind of gravity, as if the photograph itself remembered. Ruth Morrison Parker attended the opening. Her voice, though aged, was steady as she whispered to the crowd, "Jonathan always said the end of slavery was only the beginning. There will always be those who need a way out, and those willing to build the way." Sarah stood quietly in the corner, watching generations converge, the living and the long gone. In her hands, she still held the original photograph, now restored and preserved. Sometimes, late at night, she would study it again, her reflection ghosting across the glass. The child's eyes seemed to look directly at her, knowing eternal, and she would wonder, how many other stories still sleep in attics, waiting for light to touch them again? How many truths hide in plain sight, disguised as ordinary moments until someone dares to look closer? The Morrison photograph had not only changed history, it had reminded Sarah and all of us that the past is never truly past. It waits, patiently, for someone curious enough to listen.